I have a picture I keep in the kitchen, hidden behind an old apple clafoutis recipe, not framed, nestled within the pages of a cookbook that has a subtle scent of old paper and cinnamon. It shows a 9-year-old Emily with a wild, sunny hairstyle, a smile that is unabashed and full of fun, and both hands holding aloft a daisy chain. It had been months since I last looked at it, perhaps more time, but this morning, while I was looking for the ideal flour-to-milk ratio, it fell out of the book and gently settled on the counter. I stopped in the middle of my reach, wiped the corner of the flour, and rested for a while. The summer before she enrolled in the private school, that picture was taken. After reading about it in a glossy magazine at the dentist's office, she had pleaded to go. Tuition was not something Michael and I had budgeted for, but we managed. In those days we always did. She had meticulously folded and knotted a letter with red yarn for us that Christmas. It said, "Thank you for having faith in me. I'll bring you pride." That letter is sticking with me as well, in the attic in a box. This morning, while I was standing over the stove mixing batter and thinking about daisies, I was unaware that there was an envelope at the front door, sent by courier, presented in a formal manner. I was dusting the front room windowsill when it arrived, something I don't often do anymore, but today the light caught the dust so well that I couldn't help but notice it. It was a quick knock. The courier acknowledged my name, smiled courteously, and gave me a wax-sealed, thick cream envelope as soon as I opened the door. Even before I looked down, I could tell it was an invitation to her wedding. However, there was no name when I turned it over, only the address. It wasn't her penmanship. Additionally, there was not a card addressed to Mother, Mum, or Marianne when I eventually opened it with the letter opener Michael used for holiday cards. I didn't even have a card, just the official printed invitation. The honor of your presence is requested by Emily Grace Harrow and Jeremy Callum Banks. Below it is a little insert card that reads, "Seats are reserved and limited. Please reply by the 5th. Unfortunately, no more visitors." No message. Not a message, not even my name. I looked at it for a long time. To be precise, my eyes didn't sting. The silence was more like a thudding, as if you were standing in a room that once had sound, as though there could be something concealed within. I flipped the card over once and then again. It didn't say anything else, though. Just to hear my name called, I dialed June. She didn't inquire as to why I had called, simply listen, and she said, "I guess it's about the wedding," when I hesitated too long. So she was aware. They all did. I didn't even know until June, who only sees Emily in newsletter headlines and shopping aisles. I replied, "I received the invitation, and I don't have a seat at the table." After that, we were silent for a short while. In her own way, she recognized the significance of purposefully avoiding visibility. I went to the hall closet after we hung up. I pulled down the linen-wrapped souvenir box that I hadn't touched in 5 years. The heirloom was in there. A wristband. Rose gold, 6 beautiful charms. On my wedding day, my mother presented it to me. I was 22. The clasp had undergone 2 repairs. Emily dropped the heart charm on the kitchen tiles on her 3rd birthday, causing a little dent. As though it had broken her, she had sobbed. When she got married, she used to ask whether she may wear it. I used to answer, yes. I was now uncertain as to whether she even recalled its existence. I allowed its coolness to sink into my skin while I held it in my palm. Vengeance didn't feel like it, not quite yet, just a fact I'd been afraid to mention. This has nothing to do with a bracelet. It was about being rewritten in silence. I put the bracelet back in the box and put it back in its pouch. I then brought the invitation to the hearth. It wasn't burned by me. It would have been excessively noisy. Instead, I placed it between the pages of an old gardening book that no one ever borrowed, folding it once and then again. I kept it a secret. Not quite yet. However, I kept the artifact secured in the drawer that houses my will, and I silently turned the key. I made the bed with greater care than usual the morning after I got the invitation. In a sort of silent discipline, I tucked the edges of the sheets under the mattress, fluffed the pillows twice, and straightened the corners of the quilt. It didn't improve anything. However, it gave me the impression that something was still there. Rituals that don't require any effort from you can be comforting. I then opened the sideboard drawer and proceeded to the dining room via the slender hallway. This time, not for the bracelet, but for the documents. Family folder. Unaltered since Michael's death, it contained the original will. When Emily was just starting college, we had drafted it together on a soggy afternoon at the solicitor's office. Her marriage, our deaths, and the question of what would be left behind all seemed so distant back then. Fairly we had divided things, his cufflinks for her spouse, whoever he may be in the future, the university library's books. Of course, the house for her. From mother to daughter, the heirloom was handed down. I traced the clause's edge with my finger. Everything was still there, witnessed and signed. However, nothing felt the same. It was too quiet in the house. The clatter of cookware, birthday candles, muddy boots by the door, laughter, and music used to fill it. It contained only echoes now, as well as myself. Just before June hung up the previous day, I remembered what she had said. Perhaps you don't have to give away something just because someone asks for them. That stuck in my mind. After taking the will, I carefully set it down on the kitchen table. After that, I made a cup of tea for myself and let it cool. Slowly, the day went by. The violets in the front window were watered by me. I trimmed the ivy on the steps of its dead leaves. Emily sent a card that read, "Thanks for everything." And I cleaned the bookshelf that contained all of the old holiday cards. "I adore you." She had sketched a tiny heart beside her name. 7 years have passed since then. Prior to meeting Elise. Prior to Elise, even after they moved in together, referring to me as Marianne rather than Mum. 1 year passed, then 2, then an invitation that came too late to accept, before the holidays began to change, then none at all. Elise is not to fault. Not totally. What people are permitted to do is shaped by them. Emily also allowed herself to be molded, and I wrote a letter that night. Not to Emily, to my solicitor Harold, just a quick reminder to make an appointment. No rush. No rage. Just the obvious conclusion that something needs to be updated at last. The heirloom was not mentioned by me. I didn't have to. I folded the letter, put it next to the front door, and sealed it with a piece of plain tape. I would personally walk it to the post the next morning, but for the time being it sat where guests used to leave their coats, shoes, and vows to come back soon. On that night, I didn't cry. I did, however, open the drawer again and put my hand inside the pouch containing the bracelet. It was heavier than I had recalled. Or perhaps I simply carried it in a different way now. I went back to the picture of her holding daisies and smiling up at the sky that was on the counter before I went to bed. I temporarily supported it next to the sink with a wooden clip. Want to see her face without the layers of quiet that cover it. I then flipped it over. And when I went, I turned off the lights in the kitchen. It was a calm morning at the post office. A young mother was whispering directions to a toddler who kept removing the Velcro from his shoes, and I was in line behind an elderly man whose hands were shaking. When it was my turn, I gave the clerk the letter, which was just an envelope with Harold's address on it. He didn't give me a lengthy look. Like any other piece of mail, simply weigh it, stamp it, and slide it into the sorting tray. However, it seemed to me that something had changed. Not too loudly, simply said, firmly. I didn't immediately go back home. I passed the bakery with its foggy windows and the florist setting out buckets of soft peonies as I strolled through the village square. I briefly contemplated entering and purchasing a modest bouquet for myself. However, the gesture felt a little rushed, so I continued to walk, Even with the sun shining, the air had that sharpness of early spring, just cold enough to prickle the fingers. It brought back memories of Easter mornings in the past, when Emily would dash across the garden barefoot, too thrilled by her chocolate eggs to care about her shoes. Wearing a sweater and giving her strong cautions about chilly toes. I used to accompany her. She would chuckle and remark, "But Mum, it's sunny, it's warm," and even though I secretly admired the way she defied the season, I would pretend to chastise her while grinning. Like breath on a window pane, that remembrance came and vanished. The sun had changed by the time I got home. Long golden rays of light streamed through the kitchen window. It focused on the corners of dust particles drifting in the silence, illuminating the edges of the ancient bookshelves. I watched it for a while eating a piece of bread at the table. There was no phone call, no email. 3 weeks remained till the wedding. I unlocked the drawer containing the extra keys, which were hidden beneath a stack of discarded candles and a pen that had dried out. The list of emergency contacts, written in Michael's neat hand, was at the far back and was something I hadn't looked at in years. The second name on the list was that of our daughter. Our long-disconnected old telephone number was next to it. I touched the ink with my fingers. It's still evident, still positive. And so far away now. I reorganized the living room during the afternoon. For air, not for visitors. There were none. I cleaned the side table where a teacup had formerly been permanently placed, shook out the throw blanket, and shifted the armchair to the window. I discovered a note Emily had written at the age of 14, hidden beneath a pile of old magazines. "Return before supper. I adore you." It was scrawled on a receipt from the library. I had kept it for no apparent reason. I guess it was just the softer tone of the words. I returned it to its original location. I didn't have to watch it once more. I sat with the will that night. Take your time reading it. I then took out a blank page from the top drawer. That night, I didn't decide anything. However, I started a list. Assets weren't involved. It contained tales, tiny ones, quiet ones, the kind that are kept secret, unless they are documented in writing. When Emily was brushing her hair, she sung to herself. She liked to arrange her pencils according to color. I heard a purr from the day she brought a kitten home and concealed it in the laundry basket. I jotted them down, not for her, however, for me, so that I would not only remember what I had given, but also who I had been. The branches caressed the window pane as the wind outside grew stronger. I sat still, no rage, no sadness, simply the gradual, steady cadence of letting go. I folded the list and set it next to the antique pouch. I kept what I was doing a secret, not quite yet. However, I didn't turn off the hallway light, and I allowed it to remain for the first time in weeks. A thin layer of translucent plastic still hung over the dress in the back of the closet. 3/4 sleeves, a modest neckline, and cream lace. In case there was ever a wedding, I had purchased it the year Emily graduated. I hadn't spoken it out, but it was a mother-of-the-bride dress. That morning I pulled it out, but not to put it on, simply to check if it still had the appearance I remembered. Yes, it did. Gentle, easy, nice. The tag remained fastened. I used both hands to smooth the fabric as I laid it carefully across the bedspread. I briefly pictured me wearing it, unnoticed, sitting calmly in the back row. Elise is waiting for her at the end of the aisle as she walks down it in a cathedral or a sunny park. However, that was not my moment. It had never been. I put the dress back in the closet after folding it, not using the plastic this time. Even if something is never utilized, it still needs to breathe. I baked that afternoon, not to celebrate, not even to feel comfortable. It's just habit. Cardamom, butter, and flour. What my heart had forgotten, my hands remembered. Creaming sugar into a soft consistency has a reassuring quality. After making shortbread, I put it in a tin I hadn't used since Christmas. After then, I scrawled Emily's name on a piece of paper without giving it much thought. Not as a designation, just a friendly reminder. I folded it in half after that and tossed it aside. The biscuits were not sent by me. I did not make a call. Rather, I sat in the garden with a blanket pulled over my lap, a steaming cup of tea on the stone table, and my coat buttoned high. The creak of the gate, which no one used any more, and the low flutter of sparrows near the fence were the only sounds in the silence. I considered what people say when they want to be nice, such as, "Maybe she's just overburdened with planning," or, "I'm sure she still loves you." However, love remembers names on envelopes, and a mother is not erased by planning. Lavender and wet earth from the previous year's growth, which was still there in brittle grey sprigs, filled the air. A few snowdrops had started to blossom along the back wall, across the yard, defiantly early. In order to see them the following season, I noted that I should move them closer to the window. Small acts of self-compassion. At dusk the phone rang once. I let the voicemail go. After clicking and pausing, the machine became quiet. Not a message. I failed to look up the number. I would have known if it had been her. Rather, I grabbed for the letter opener and opened the drawer in the study, where I kept the heirloom and the will. I never used it. I simply held it, both familiar and cold. I then took out another envelope. Years ago I had made one, sealed but never sent. It was written the night Michael passed away and was addressed to Emily. In an attempt to give her a sense of him while it was still close enough to feel, I had sat at this very desk and tried to describe the weight of his absence. There was a note inside. A couple of sentences, nothing significant, simply put, "He loved you very much," even when he was at a loss for words. Then I agreed too. I had sent it by mail. I had waited for the ideal time. Her birthday passed, then the following one, years later. Now that the wedding was just a few days away, I slid the message out of the envelope. The paper remained crisp, however the words seemed farther distant. I folded it once more. I didn't put it back in the drawer this time. I set it on fire, on the hearth, not out of rage, but as a release of sorts. The grey, gentle smoke curled upward and vanished through the chimney. In the silence that ensued, I glanced at the bracelet that was still in its pouch. It wasn't moved by me. I simply sat with it. Beside me, the past folded neatly. Around it, the room is growing darker. In my hand, the match is still warm. 5 days remained before the wedding. The local florist had a chalkboard outside that said, "Congratulations, Emily and Elise," around 2 p.m. on June 10th. So I knew this without anyone telling me. The names were surrounded by joyful loops of painted tulips underneath. For a few minutes that morning I stood across the street and observed the woman behind the counter as she enthusiastically and quickly tied ribbons around flower stems. I was unknown to her, or perhaps she did, but she chose not to look me in the eye. The flowers had a beautiful appearance. Customers carrying deposit envelopes and slips of paper entered the store as a little bell rung. I didn't enter. I had nothing to purchase. Taking the long way home, I passed the area where Emily had flown her first kite. To make her laugh, Michael had run along her while feigning exhaustion. She had referred to him as the world's best wind catcher. I could still hear her voice from that time, too huge for her petite frame, but high and sweet. The recollection itself seemed to belong to someone else now. When I got home, I grabbed the tea caddy from the kitchen cupboard. As typically happens when the humidity increases, the lid caught just a little. The remaining jasmine blend, a tea Emily had once brought back from a school excursion to Bath, was inside. I had mistakenly kept it until a memorable moment. I made a cup and sipped it while looking out the window. Age had made it bitter. I entered the study that afternoon and opened the Harrowed updated copy folder. I turned to the third page, which was where the heirloom clause had been since it was initially written. Marianne Harrow's rose gold bracelet will be given to her daughter, Emily Harrow, on the occasion of her marriage. I went through it 3 times. I then grabbed a pen out of the holder. I haven't crossed it out yet. Rather, I put "if given" in the margin. 2 words, no signature, no choice. However, enough to maintain a pause. I put the file back in the drawer after closing it. That night I prepared soup. Simple, comforting, and grounding leeks and potatoes. I had always made it when Emily was ill as a child, clutching a tissue and sniffling while her tiny knees were brought to her chest on the couch. It tasted like safety, she once told me. I ate in silence, by myself. After that I had to fold linens that I hadn't used in months. Pillowcases that still had a subtle lavender water scent. When we hosted company, I would bring out a set of napkins with embroidered corners, the type of labor that requires nothing more than steady hands. I discovered another item in the drawer's bottom, Michael's note. It was short. "Remember, M's favourite biscuits," he wrote in his typical shorthand at the foot of a grocery list. He was referring to me. I touched the ink with my thumb. After that, put it next to the bracelet-containing pouch. Not because it was required. However, it made me realize that someone had once remembered the little things. I carried a bag of books to the charity shop the following morning. I walked past the mirror in the foyer on my way out. I was shocked to see my reflection. I was unaware that my hair had turned grey at the temples, or how serene my eyes appeared. They were no longer in a storm. It's just the tide going out. I never again opened the invitation. I didn't look for any new information. I didn't inquire about being mentioned in a toast or speech. Rather, I went to the garden and chopped some thyme and rosemary sprigs. I hung them in the kitchen window to dry after tying them with twine. For commemoration, to be clear. I set the treasure on the table as the sun sank behind the house and took a seat next to it. To keep it a secret, not to keep it indefinitely, only to make a choice, silently, without a witness. I got up before the sun came up on the wedding morning. There was silence in the house. Not even the birds outside the window had started singing. For a time, I stood in the hallway barefoot, listening for anything. But I couldn't identify it. Maybe a knock, a call, some distant rustle of consciousness. However, there was just quiet. I prepared tea, English breakfast, familiar and potent, but not jasmine this time. Wrapped in the cardigan Michael used to wear when the boiler acted up, I sipped it carefully at the kitchen table. There was a slight cedar scent about it. The jewelry was sitting on the counter next to me. The previous evening, I had removed it from the drawer and kept it out in case I had second thoughts. However, I hadn't. The gentle morning light was captured by the metal and kept there like breath. I ran my finger over the dented charm from all those years ago and gently flipped the clasp over in my hand. It was still a little crooked. Mine yet. I gathered the linens and put them in the washing machine about 7 o'clock. A minor assignment. The day felt like any other because of something. I didn't dress up. I didn't get ready to go out. I did, however, stuff a handkerchief into my pocket. Old routines. June called at 9. She said, "I wasn't sure if I should say anything." "I understand," I answered. She didn't say kind things. She was more aware. After a while she said, "I saw a photo." "Online?" Emily wearing her gown, Elise at her side. They appeared glowing. "I'm positive they did." My voice was free of bitterness, just the truth. "She will be sorry you weren't there, perhaps." I didn't mean to imply hope, just a chance. I went outside to the garden when we hung up. The rosemary was drying nicely. Unexpectedly, the lavender had started to bloom once more. I got down on my knees and pulled some weeds from behind the hedge. Soil under my fingernails. The sun is warming my back. It's the sort of morning where you forget you weren't invited. I rose and gazed up toward the garden's far edge, where the ancient birdbath was standing, moss-covered and cracked. At one point, Emily and I painted it together, using dish sponges to dab blue paint on the rim. It has faded long ago. I thought about cleaning it, painting it again, adding a new hue. However, I choose to ignore it. To be remembered, things didn't have to be recreated. I took the bracelet inside and put it in a new envelope. It wasn't the original package. The velvet pouch, no. A simple envelope, cushioned. I didn't write a name. Not a word. No address for return. I then sealed it. Then I put it in the drawer under my scarves, next to the brooch I wore only to funerals and the winter gloves I never used. Peaceful spot to rest. I had a glass of water and sat on the front step that afternoon, watching the neighborhood settle into its weekend rhythm. 2 doors were being mowed by someone. A child with streamers trailing from the handlebars of a bicycle passed. There was a subtle scent of cake and cut grass in the air. I pictured the wedding taking place far away, in a garden perhaps, or in a hall with candles and flowers, champagne glasses, and I pictured her standing there, aware of who was around and who wasn't. I didn't think about it. Like a letter never sent, I just folded the moment in half. I went through the home at dusk and switched off each light individually, from one room to another, from memory to memory. I opened the file one last time and crossed out the clause when I got to the study. I put a single line across the bracelet, which will be given to her daughter Emily Harrow. No substitute, no rewording, simply a place where something was. I then flipped to the next page and started a fresh one. There was a thank you card 2 days after the wedding. I was aware of it before I even opened the envelope. Emily's handwriting, the thick cream stock, and the hurried and wide loop of her G's. Inside, we appreciate your thoughtfulness and thank you for the gift. Emily and Elise did not specify the nature of the present. No mum, no affection, no warmth. Only those 3 brief lines. And I felt absolutely nothing for the first time. Not injured. I'm not shocked. Not even worn out. Simply put, finished. I put the card next to the kettle on the counter. After making tea, I unlocked the back door and went barefoot into the garden. The sun had warmed the stones, and the air was rich with the aroma of rosemary. The world continued to move. Through the hedge, birds continued to dart. Bees flew low. I was still living. I had continued to exist, even after Emily's wedding. That tiny insight enveloped me like a robe. I started making a list in the afternoon after opening a fresh notebook, the same unlined one Michael used, to jot down his sermon. Not of family treasures, not of complaints, however, of names. Names of those who remained. Last winter, when I twisted my ankle, June had brought me soup. When walking her dog, Rena from next door would always wave. Clara, my niece, called without fail on the 3rd Thursday. Thomas, the gardener, continued to me whether I would like to replant the hydrangeas that Michael used to like. One by one, their names filled the page. Witnesses to My Life is the title I gave it, because I've realized that rejection isn't the only thing we grieve the most. It is not visible, ignored, take a cut out of the picture, and occasionally we fail to notice who is still in the picture. The hallway mirror with the tiny break in the upper left corner, that had been since Emily was 12 years old, was the one I was standing in front of that night. Following a fight at school dance, she had hurled a hairbrush against the wall. I had reprimanded her. She had shed tears. Without a word, we had gone for ice cream afterwards. The mirror had never been changed by me. I stared at it now, at myself, not looking for wrinkles, grief, or age, just acknowledgement. I still had my own appearance. I didn't touch the crack when I switched off the light. I didn't look for wedding pictures in the press in the days that followed. I didn't ask June if my name had come up. I didn't search other people's stories for myself. In the mornings, instead, I widened the window. I put the lavender back in. Despite the fact that nobody had requested to visit, I purchased fresh bedding for the guest room. Quietly, I survived. The vicar arrived on Sunday. In addition to an invitation to speak at the women's meeting next month, on recollection, he added, or tradition if I wanted. He gave a little tin of lemon cookies. I accepted with a smile. He had no idea what that insignificant act meant. He didn't have to. I went back to the study before going to bed. The corrected version was now neatly tucked inside its folder when I opened the will. I slipped in my list of names, the notebook I had begun. I then added, immediately below the previous lines, and me. Since I, too, witnessed this existence, I had persevered, I had recalled, and even though I had been urged to disappear, I had refused. The moon had risen outside. I let the silence to develop around me while I sat in its gentle glow. The bracelet was neither lost or given. It was still in its envelope, where I had left it, simply kept. Finally, I realized that retaining it had never truly meant depriving Emily of anything. It had been about giving myself permission to wait. To the legacy, to honor, to oneself. It wasn't moved by me, not quite yet. However, I put a blank label on the front of the envelope, not for mailing, in order for me to choose whose name, if anyone's, would be written there one day. I got a voicemail a week after the wedding. It was brief, perhaps 30 seconds. Emily's cautious, courteous voice. "Hello, just dropping in. We have returned from the coast. Everything went smoothly. Again, thank you for the present. I hope all is okay with you." Nothing about the absence was mentioned. The vacant seat is not acknowledged. Words that are superficial, like water skimming a glass. I didn't return the call. I also didn't remove it, like a tardy guest who refused to apologize. I let it to remain in the machine's memory. I discovered the envelope once more when I opened the top drawer of my writing desk that morning. The bracelet is still within, unclaimed as of yet. Silently, I noticed that it no longer felt weighty after turning it over in my hands. I went to the library later that day. I hadn't entered through those double doors in years. However, the scent remained the same. Dust lurking in the recesses of recollection. Old pages and lemon polish. A small girl was hunched over a bird book near the wide window. Her mother sat next to her and gestured softly toward a passage. The girl's expression brightened. At that age she resembled Emily exactly. My breath caught in my chest for a second, not from suffering, but from acknowledgement. I requested a copy of the local history brochure I had assisted in revising years prior. When I arrived at the archive counter, with a courteous smile, the volunteer opened a drawer and gave it to me right away. The acknowledgements still contained my name. Last line, small type. It gave me a sense of belonging, not removed. Tucked away in the pages of an unfinished work, I took it home with me. I started sorting that evening. Not only documents, however, space. I removed any knickknacks that were no longer visible from the top of the hallway cabinet. Dusting behind the clock, I reorganized the bookshelves in the living room. I let the air in by opening the window above the stairs, which hadn't been opened in years. I then lowered the cedar box, the one that contained a pressed flower from our first anniversary, our wedding pictures and Michael's letters. And another thing. A little silk satchel. My grandmother's pearl brooch is within. I didn't realize it was there. Or maybe I had decided to. The will didn't call for it. None of the inheritance documents mentioned it. As I held it in my palm, I recalled how her hand felt when she pinned it to my collar when I was 18. It was delicate, veined, and always smelled like lavender water. She had stated, "This is for when you need to feel like yourself again." At Michael's funeral, I wore it, not since. I have attached it to my cardigan's interior. Nobody would notice. However, I would be aware. I stood before the mirror, not to look but to observe. I was there. Not lessened, not taken out, just got back. The following day, I walked to June's place with the old gardening gloves I had promised to offer her and a tin of shortbread. In her kitchen, we sat and talked calmly about nothing specific. How women behave when they have given up attempting to be understood by everyone and are only interested in being present. She stroked my hand and whispered, "You seem clearer," before I left. "I am," I said. "Do you intend to talk to her?" "Eventually," I answered, however, not for her benefit. She gave a nod, as though it were the appropriate response. I created a fresh document at home, not permitted, personal only. "To whom it may concern after I'm gone" is the title of the letter. I described the heirloom in it, where it came from, its voyage, and why it was left unassigned for the time being. I wrote, "Memory, not metal, is how some things are carried down. If you are holding this letter, know that I kept it for myself, my identity, and the tale I lived, not because I was unkind. I put my signature on it. I folded it, then set it down next to the mail. I didn't write a will that night. I composed a recipe. Before I tried to make it more sophisticated, before the cardamom, Emily liked shortbread the way she did. Just flour, sugar, and butter. Easy. Actual. I didn't take it off the counter, not labeled, but prepared in case someone happened to peek. They were in town today." Arm in arm, Emily and Elise leave the cafe by the bookstore. Emily was wearing a green scarf that I had never seen before, and Elise was carrying a pastry box. They gazed, satisfied, or simply put it into practice. They failed to notice me. I pretended to read the headline of a gardening magazine as I stood next to the newsstand. A light wind blew over the street, and I heard a few words from their laughter, nothing particularly noticeable, only the form of a sound I used to recognize. After turning the bend, they vanished. I didn't pay attention. I purchased the magazine instead. I wanted to walk home with something of my own, not because I needed it. Upon arriving home, I set the magazine, still unread, next to the teapot on the kitchen table. I then opened the drapes wide and entered the front room. The light poured in copiously, illuminating the lip of the bowl on the sideboard where Michael kept his spare coins, as well as the edges of picture frames and books. Dried eucalyptus and a folded piece of paper that I hadn't opened in years, one of Emily's school drawings, were now in that bowl. A bird in a nest, marked home, and a tree with improbable pink leaves. I had kept it there for protection at one point, for recollection. I carefully unfolded it now. Compared to my memory, the paper was thinner. The hues were no longer vibrant. However, the word remained, scrawled in red crayon, "At home." I put it back in the dish after folding it again. Not as a place of worship, merely as a marker. After a couple of hours, I went back to the study desk and opened the drawer that still had the bracelet in its envelope. I put the recipe next to it. Then I inserted another thing, very gently, the pearl brooch in the silk purse. I had no idea what I was creating. A legacy, a box of pieces, a silent bequest that no one had earned, but that someone could eventually realize. But I was aware that it felt finished. On top of the pile, I penned a little letter, to be carefully opened only. After that, I shut the drawer. I locked it and placed the key below the lavender pot I had placed there in the spring on the ledge. June and I sat in the park the following day. We didn't communicate much. I just watched the clouds move softly across the sky while the kids chased pigeons. She questioned me. "Do you feel any different?" at one point. I gave it some thinking. "Yes," I said. "I believe I've given up waiting." "What am I waiting for?" "To be part of it, to be pardoned, to be elucidated." She glanced down at her hands, which were folded neatly in her lap, and nodded. "The conclusion is sometimes that they never try," she stated. We didn't bring it up again. Later that night, I got a message. Not from Emily, from my niece, Clara. It said, "Recently, Aunt Marianne, you have been on my mind. I hope all is okay with you. If you don't mind, I'd love to come visit you soon." I gazed at it for quite some time. "The kettle is always on," was typed after that. "You're welcome at any time." Without hesitation, not a ceremony, just the facts, I took a leisurely stroll around the house before going to bed, one room at a time, not to see what's there, merely to observe, to be there. I stopped in the hallway under the frame of our old family portrait, which showed Michael, Emily, and myself on the cliffs at St. Ives, squinting into the light. Emily was 12 years old. She was all braces and angles and summer freckles, with her arms stretched across both of our shoulders. I made a small frame adjustment. I turned off the light after that, not because I was depressed. However, I was done searching there for her. The narrative had progressed. I had too. On a Sunday morning, Clara showed up unexpectedly, but was welcomed. Wearing a long brown coat, she was standing at the front gate, holding a tin of cookies in one hand and a bouquet of late autumn dahlias in the other. She hesitated for a second, then raised the latch and let herself in, as I watched from the kitchen window. That was the first time in years that someone had done that, like someone who understood not to ask too many questions. She gave me a firm hug. I hesitated a moment longer than I intended to. She stated, "I didn't want to cause a scene. All I wanted was to see you." We sat with buttered toast and tea in the kitchen. She told me about a buddy going through a divorce, her new work, and a book she had begun writing. As I refilled our mugs twice, I paid attention. She never once mentioned Emily, the wedding, or the things that were left unsaid. Until she did, she asked quietly as she stirred her drink, "Do you ever think she'll come back around?" I turned to face the window. "I think I've given up hoping that people will come back in the same condition that I remember," I remarked softly. Clara gave a nod. We didn't bring it up again. When she was gone, I went back to the study drawer. The recipe, the envelope, the brooch, and the little handwritten letter addressed to whom it may concern after I'm gone, were all removed. Additionally, I included a picture, not the official graduation photo of Emily, not the St. Ives family photo browned by the sun. Only Michael and I stood next to the lavender shrub in the middle of summer in the garden. We're laughing at something that's just out of frame, not the camera. For the final time, I tucked it between the pages and shut the drawer. That evening, I prepared soup, only for myself. I didn't assign 2 spots. I turned off the hall light. I did, however, play a piece of music by Vaughan Williams that I hadn't heard in a long time. Soft strings that rose subtly like a memory. I let it to fill the room as I stood in the center of it. It served as a reminder that life goes on by making room for new forms rather than by forgetting. I became a member of a local writing club in the weeks that followed. There were just 6 of us, mostly ladies and a few reserved guys. Every week we got together at the library to share stories that were too delicate for casual talk. Really, no one knew mine. However, I conveyed the important details, memory, quiet, and the way that some things are passed down, like recipes, modified slightly but still prepared with care. They paid attention, and I felt held in that little circle, as Emily's name appeared in the village newsletter one afternoon as the leaves were starting to turn yellow, a contribution to the communal garden made in her honor. Don't bring me up, not a message. However, I grinned, because gardens don't harbor resentment, they simply develop. I eventually emptied the linen closet's top shelf the same week. I discovered a pile of birthday cards that I had originally intended to send, all of them blank and lovingly selected. I held on to 2, the remainder was recycled. I continued to move. I started teaching Clara how to make shortbread the old-fashioned manner, without orange zest or cardamom, just sugar, flour, and butter. She claimed that the recipe tasted like patience and Sunday mornings. She turned to face me on her most recent visit, Her eyes gentle and perceptive, she said, "You kept the bracelet. Have you ever made a decision regarding it?" I gave a nod. I did. She made no further requests. We sat in silence after she simply put her hand on mine, not in sorrow, but in a softer way. I wrote one last note the following morning. To Clara. I'm not here any more if you find this. You can keep the bracelet or not. Don't pass it on if you don't think it will be handled carefully. Who asks the loudest does not define legacy. Who remembers with affection is the question. Marianne, with everything I have. I closed the note, put it in the envelope. The envelope was then put in the cedar box with the others, and I closed the lid while standing in the dawn light. This was not retaliation. Not even defiance was involved. It was elegance, silent and all mine.